In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a scream pierces the grandeur of the Victoria Hall, as opera star Madame Eleanor Voss collapses mid-area, poisoned by cyanide. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unravelling secrets, steps into a web of jealousy, ambition, and devotion. Was it the fiery director, the envious co-star, the nervous assistant, or the obsessive fan who laced her glass? As clues unfold, smudged programs, stained petals, and a suspicious perfume bottle, Miss Marple's quiet wisdom reveals a truth as dramatic as the stage itself. In just 30 seconds, dive into a tale of betrayal where every note hides a motive. Chapter 1. The curtain rises. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its drowsy lanes and ivy-clad cottages, was not accustomed to the clamour of high art. Yet, each September, the St. Mary Mead Opera Festival transformed the sleepy hamlet into a stage for grandeur, drawing enthusiasts from as far as London to its newly restored Victoria Hall. The theatre, a relic of Georgian ambition with its faded velvet seats and gilt-trimmed boxes, hummed with anticipation for this year's production of La Traviata. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her chintz-covered armchair by the bay window of her cottage, had followed the preparations through the eager chatter of her maid, Cherry Baker, whose ear for gossip was as sharp as her dusting was haphazard. "It's Madame Elena Voss, miss," Cherry had said that morning, setting down a tray of tea and scones with a flourish. "A proper star, they say, with a voice like an angel. Sings all over Europe, but she's come here, to our little theatre. Mind you, there's talk of trouble, tempers flaring at rehearsals, and that director, Mr. Randall, shouting fit to wake the dead." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, had flickered with interest. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers lingering on the soft wool as she considered. Trouble, she knew, had a way of blooming in the hothouse of ambition, much like the roses in her garden, that thrived on careful tending but could still harbour blight. Her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a fondness for the dramatic, had sent her a ticket to observe the final rehearsal, insisting she'd enjoy the spectacle. "It's culture, Aunt Jane," he'd written, "and you're sharper than half the critics in London." So it was that Miss Marple, in her neat black coat and hat, adorned with a single violet, found herself seated in the third row of Victoria Hall that crisp autumn morning. The theatre smelled of polished wood and old velvet, with a faint undercurrent of paint from the recent renovations. On stage, Madame Elena Voss, a statuesque woman with raven hair and a presence that seemed to command the very air, was in the midst of Sempre Libera. Her voice soared, pure and piercing, filling the hall with a vibrancy that made even the stage-hands pause. Miss Marple, her hands folded over her knitting bag, watched not just the singer, but the faces around her, the musicians in the pit, the crew in the wings, the handful of onlookers in the stalls. People, she thought, were never so revealing as when they believed themselves unobserved. The aria reached its climax, and Madame Voss lifted a glass of water from the prop table, a simple gesture to soothe her throat. She took a sip, then another, her expression serene. But as the final note hung in the air, a shadow crossed her face. Her hand flew to her throat, the glass slipped from her fingers, and with a gasp that was not part of the score, she crumpled to the stage. A scream, high, jagged, erupted from a stage hand. The conductor dropped his baton, and chaos broke loose. Miss Marple remained still, her lips pursed, as the theatre dissolved into a flurry of shouts and running feet. A doctor, fortuitously present among the audience, rushed forward, his face grim as he knelt beside the fallen soprano. "She's dead," he announced after a moment, his voice cutting through the din. "Poison, I'd wager." There's a faint, almond-like smell. The word poison rippled through the crowd, sharp as a plucked string. Miss Marple's knitting bag lay untouched in her lap, her mind already threading together the scene. She noted the glass, now shattered on the stage, its contents seeping into the boards. She observed the prop table, cluttered with goblets, flowers, and a discarded script, positioned just off stage where anyone might have lingered. And she saw the faces, some shocked, some calculating, that turned toward the lifeless form of Madame Voss. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with a practised eye. Miss Marple knew him well, a solid man, thorough but not imaginative, prone to missing the subtler notes of human nature. He nodded to her, a touch of deference in his manner, for he had learned to value her insights in past cases. "A bad business, Miss Marple," he said, mopping his brow. "We'll need statements from everyone backstage." This wasn't an accident. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild. "Indeed, Inspector." A voice like Madame Voss's does not fall silent by chance. She rose, her small figure unobtrusive amid the chaos, and made her way to the foyer, where she could watch the comings and goings. Murder, she thought, was like a badly rehearsed play, full of miscues and hidden intentions, waiting for someone to read the script aright. As she settled onto a bench, her eyes caught the flicker of movement backstage, a director's scowl, a co-star's too quick glance, an assistant's trembling hands, a fan's tearful stare. The curtain had risen, and Miss Marple knew the drama was only beginning. Chapter 2. The players assembled. The Victoria Hall, its grandeur dimmed by the morning's tragedy, stood heavy with the scent of dust and dread. The stage, where only hours ago Madame Elena Voss had poured her soul into Verdi's notes, was now a silent crime scene, cordoned off by Inspector Craddock's men. The auditorium, with its rows of crimson seats, echoed with hushed whispers as the cast and crew milled about, their faces a gallery of shock, suspicion, and carefully guarded secrets. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner of the foyer, her knitting bag at her side, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a hawk watching a field. Her presence, as ever, went largely unnoticed, save by Inspector Craddock, who, despite his methodical nature, knew better than to dismiss the elderly spinster's keen insight. The inspector, his notebook open and his pencil poised, had gathered the key figures backstage in the green room, a cramped space cluttered with costume racks and faded posters from past productions. Miss Marple, invited by Craddock to linger in case she noticed anything useful, sat just outside, her ears attuned to the murmurs filtering through the half-open door. She had declined a seat within, preferring the vantage point of the foyer, where she could see the comings and goings of those not yet under scrutiny. Her fingers moved rhythmically over her knitting, the soft click of needles a counterpoint to the tension in the air. To the casual observer, she was merely an old lady passing the time, but her mind was as sharp as the pins in her skein, piecing together the fragments of the morning's calamity. Inspector Craddock, his voice steady but tinged with impatience, began his inquiries. "We're dealing with murder," he said, addressing the 4 individuals who had been closest to the prop table where the fatal glass of water had stood. Cyanide, the doctor says. Quick, deadly, and not the sort of thing one keeps in a pocket by accident. Someone placed it in Madame Voss's glass, and I intend to find out who Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she listened. Cyanide, she thought, was a choice both bold and intimate, requiring access and intent. It was not a poison of impulse, but of calculation. And calculation, in her experience, often sprang from the heart's darker corners, envy, greed, or fear. She turned her attention to the 4 suspects, each of whom she had observed during the rehearsal, their movements and expressions now taking on new significance in the light of murder. First was Mr. Hugo Randall, the director, a man whose presence filled the room like a gust of wind through an open window. He was tall, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that burned with the intensity of one accustomed to command. His voice, when he spoke, carried the resonance of the stage, though now it was edged with indignation. "This is preposterous," he declared, pacing before the costume rack. "I've worked with Elena for years. She was difficult, God knows. Her demands could drive a saint to drink, but I'd no reason to harm her. My career rides on this production. Her death is a disaster." Miss Marple, from her perch, noted the flush in his cheeks and the way his hands clenched as he spoke. She recalled Cherry's gossip about Randall's temper, how he'd thrown a chair during a rehearsal when a tenor missed his cue. Ambition, she mused, was a powerful force, but so was pride, and Randall's pride seemed as fragile as the glass that had shattered on the stage. She thought of Mr. Hargraves, a saint, Mary Mead grocer who'd once sabotaged a rival's delivery to secure a contract, only to regret the scandal that followed. Randall, she suspected, might fear ruin more than he admitted. Next was Miss Clara Duval, the co-star and understudy, a woman in her late 20s whose beauty was as deliberate as a well-rehearsed aria. Her blonde hair was pinned in a chignon, and her eyes, a striking green, held a calculated warmth that flickered when the inspector's questions grew pointed. "I was in my dressing room," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I had no reason to be near the prop table." I admired Elena truly. She was an inspiration. Her lips curved into a smile, but Miss Marple, watching through the doorway, saw a tightness at the corners, a hint of strain. Clara's role as Violetta's confidant was minor, but as understudy, she stood to inherit the spotlight. Miss Marple remembered a village seamstress, Miss Carter, whose envy of a rival's needlework had led to a slashed gown at a fete. Envy, she thought, could wear a mask as lovely as Clara's. Then there was Mr. Timothy Wren, the director's assistant, a slight man with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled as he clutched a clipboard. Its pages crumpled from anxious gripping. "I fetched the water, yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my job. Props, costumes, whatever Mr. Randall needs. But I didn't touch the contents. I swear it." His eyes darted to Randall as if seeking approval, and Miss Marple wondered at the depth of his loyalty. Timothy reminded her of young Tommy Pierce, a saint. Mary Mead lad who'd once taken the blame for a stolen pie to protect an older boy. Loyalty, she knew, could be a chain as binding as fear. Last was Miss Beatrice Lyle, a fan whose devotion to Madame Voss bordered on the fanatical. She was a plain woman in her 40s, her brown hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I only wanted to see her," she said, her voice breaking. "I brought flowers, roses, her favourite. I left them on the prop table, that's all." Her hands twisted a handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted the intensity in her gaze, as if Voss's death had robbed her of more than a performance. Beatrice's cottage, Cherry had whispered, held a shrine to the soprano. Programmes, clippings, even a lock of hair bought at an auction. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Finch, a St. Mary Mead widow who'd clung to her late husband's memory with a fervour that unnerved her neighbours. Devotion, she reflected, could curdle into something dangerous. Inspector Craddock, his notebook filled with scribbled details, turned to the stage manager, Mr. Phelps, a stout man with a weary air. "You were backstage," Craddock said. "Did you see anyone near the prop table before Madame Voss took the glass?" Phelps rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. "It's a busy place, Inspector." Randall was there, barking orders. Clara was fussing with costumes, said she was checking her shawl. Timothy was running about, as usual, and Miss Lyle, she was hovering with those flowers. Couldn't say who touched what, though. The table's in plain sight, but no one's watching it every second. Miss Marple's needles paused. The prop table, she thought, was the heart of the mystery. A stage within a stage where the fatal act had been set. She closed her eyes briefly, picturing its clutter. Goblets, scripts, a vase of lilies, and that single glass of water. Innocuous until it wasn't. She recalled a village fete where a tampered jug of lemonade had sickened a judge, the culprit unnoticed in the bustle. Accessibility, she mused, was the poisoner's ally. Craddock dismissed the suspects, instructing them to remain in the village, and turned to Miss Marple, who had risen to join him in the foyer. "A nasty business," he said, his voice low. "No fingerprints on the glass. Wiped clean, likely. The cyanide was in the water, but how it got there and who put it there is anyone's guess." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Not quite anyone's, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "People are predictable, in their way. Like my roses, they bloom as expected, but you must watch for the thorns. Someone had a reason to silence Madame Voss, and reasons, you know, are rarely as hidden as people think." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her cryptic insights. "You've something in mind, Miss Marple." "Only an observation," she replied, adjusting her hat. "The theatre is a place of illusions, but murder is real. I noticed Mr. Randall's temper. He argued with Madame Voss yesterday, did he not? Over her insistence on a particular costume." Craddock nodded. "The stagehand mentioned it. Said Randall called her a diva with no sense of budget. But he's got a point about the production being his lifeline. Killing his star seems a queer way to save it. Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "And Miss Duval, she stands to gain the most, doesn't she? The role of Violetta is a prize worth coveting." Craddock grunted. "She's ambitious, I'll give you that. But she claims she was in her dressing room, and no one contradicts her." "Yet," Miss Marple said softly, "and Mr. Wren, such a nervous young man. Loyalty can make one blind or complicit. And Miss Lyle, her devotion is touching, but devotion can turn to obsession, can it not?" Craddock sighed. "You see too much, Miss Marple. I'll have my men check alibis and search for that cyanide. It's not exactly sold at the chemist's." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You might ask about perfumes, Inspector." Some have an almond-like scent, I'm told. A small thing, but small things matter. As Craddock moved off to confer with his sergeant, Miss Marple settled back onto her bench. Her knitting resumed. The foyer was quieter now, but the air thrummed with unspoken questions. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a stolen letter or a whispered rumour could unravel a life. The theatre, for all its glamour, was no different. A village of egos and secrets, each player hiding a truth. She glanced at the stage, where a single spotlight still burned, casting shadows on the boards where Madame Voss had fallen. The curtain had risen on a tragedy, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, intended to see it through to its final act. Her thoughts drifted to a conversation with Cherry that morning, before the rehearsal. "They say Madame Voss was difficult," Cherry had confided, her eyes wide. "Always changing things, costumes, lighting, even the score. Made Mr. Randall furious, and Miss Duval, she just smiled, but you could tell she was seething. And that fan, Miss Lyle, she follows Madame Voss like a shadow. Gives me the shivers." Miss Marple had nodded, filing away the details as she sipped her tea. Now, those fragments took shape. A director's pride, a co-star's ambition, an assistant's fear, a fan's worship. Each was a thread in the tapestry of murder, and she would tug at them gently as she did her wool until the pattern emerged. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and made her way toward the prop table, now guarded by a constable. "May I look, officer?" she asked, and her voice sweet and unassuming. "I dropped a hairpin earlier, you see." The constable, seeing only a harmless old lady, stepped aside. Miss Marple's eyes swept the table, noting the placement of each item, the goblets, the script, the lilies wilting in their vase. The glass was gone, taken for evidence, but its absence was as telling as its presence. She bent slightly, as if searching for her hairpin, and caught a faint scent. Almonds, perhaps, or something close. She straightened, her expression unchanged, and thanked the constable. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities. The poisoner had been bold, but not reckless. The cyanide had been placed with precision, in a glass meant only for Madame Voss. Someone had known her habits, her need for water mid-area. Someone had watched, waited, and acted. She thought of the village chemist, Mr. Hodges, who'd once warned her about the dangers of certain compounds, easily disguised in small vials. A perfume bottle, perhaps, or a prop disguised as something else. She would mention it to Craddock, but not yet. Not until she had seen more of the players' performances. The theatre doors opened, admitting a gust of autumn air, and a reporter from the local paper, his pencil already scribbling. Miss Marple watched him approach Clara Duval, who greeted him with a radiant smile, her grief perfectly staged. "Such a loss," Clara said, her voice trembling just enough. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The play, she thought, was far from over, and the true drama lay not on the stage, but in the hearts of those who had stood in its shadows. Chapter 3. The director's temper. The late morning sun filtered through the high windows of Victoria Hall, casting long shadows across the auditorium, where the air still held the faint tang of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, having excused herself from the foyer to take a turn about the theatre's perimeter, now stood near the stage door, her small figure bundled against the September chill. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the bustle of Inspector Craddock's men, as they searched the wings and dressing rooms. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a prop as unassuming as herself, but her mind was far from idle, weaving together the threads of the morning's grim events. The death of Madame Helena Voss was no mere accident, and the director, Mr. Hugo Randall, with his tempestuous nature, had drawn her particular attention. Inside, the green room had grown stuffy with tension as Craddock continued his interrogations. Miss Marple, choosing to remain outside the fray, had overheard enough to know that Randall's volatile temper was a topic of whispered speculation among the cast. Cherry, her maid, had regaled her with tales of his outbursts, how he'd once smashed a prop lantern when a singer missed a cue, how his voice could carry through the theatre's walls like a storm breaking over Saint. Mary Mead's Hills. Such passion, Miss Marple thought, was a double-edged sword, capable of inspiring brilliance or destruction. She recalled Mr. Grayson, a St. Mary Mead butcher whose rages had once led to a broken shop window, and a secret debt that had nearly ruined him. Passion, she knew, often masked deeper motives. She slipped back into the theatre, her steps soft on the worn carpet, and positioned herself near a side entrance to the stage, where she could observe without drawing notice. The prop table, still cordoned off, stood just beyond, its contents meticulously catalogued by a young constable. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the spot where the fatal glass had rested, its shards now evidence in Craddock's custody. She noted the table's proximity to the director's chair, a throne-like seat from which Randall had barked orders during rehearsals. It was a vantage point, she thought, that offered both opportunity and oversight. Craddock, emerging from the green room, spotted her and approached, his expression a mix of frustration and respect. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "Randall's a tough nut to crack, admits to arguing with Voss but swears he'd never harm her. Says the production was his chance to revive his career after a string of flops in London. What do you make of him?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. "Mr. Randall is a man of fire, Inspector, but fire can burn out of control. I wonder if his arguments with Madame Voss were as professional as he claims. Did he mention their disagreement over the staging of Act 2? Craddock flipped through his notebook. He did. Said Voss wanted a grander set, more chandeliers, more velvet. Cost a fortune, and he refused. Called her a spoiled prima donna in front of the cast. Not exactly discreet indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. In Saint. Mary Mead, I once knew a schoolmaster, Mr. Hargreaves, who lost his temper over a pupil's cheek and later regretted his harsh words when the boy ran away. Public anger often hides private fears. Perhaps Mr. Randall feared Madame Voss's demands would overshadow his vision or his reputation. Craddock frowned, considering this. You think he'd kill to protect his name? Seems a stretch, with the festival riding on her performance. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her fingers brushing the wool in her bag. But reputations are fragile things, Inspector. And a man like Mr. Randall, whose career hangs by a thread, might see a threat in a star who outshines him. She excused herself and made her way toward the stage, where the stagehand, a wiry lad named Tom, was sweeping up stray petals from Beatrice Lyle's roses. A terrible thing, miss, Tom said, pausing as she approached. Never seen Mr. Randall so cross as he was with Madame Voss. Day before yesterday, he was shouting about her changing the blocking. said she was making a mockery of his work. Nearly threw his script at her. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. He does seem a passionate man. Was he near the prop table this morning, before the rehearsal? Tom scratched his head. Can't say for certain, miss. He's always pacing about, checking props, yelling at us to move faster. He was there earlier, I reckon, fussing over the goblets for Act 1. Didn't see him touch the water glass, though. Thank you, Tom, Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. She moved away, her mind turning over the image of Randall at the prop table. A director's role, she thought, was to control every detail, but control could slip into manipulation. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, Mr. Sims, who'd poisoned a rival's roses to win a prize, his anger at being outdone cloaked in meticulous care. Randall, with his need for dominance, might have seen Voss's brilliance as a challenge too great to bear. She found herself near Randall's chair, now empty, its armrests worn from his restless grip. A discarded program lay nearby, its pages crumpled as if clenched in anger. She bent to retrieve it, her movement slow, and noted a faint mark on the cover, a smudge of ink perhaps, or something more telling. She tucked it into her bag, resolving to examine it later, and turned her attention to the stage, where Craddock was questioning a violinist from the orchestra. The violinist, a nervous young woman named Miss Ellis, was wringing her hands. Mr. Randall was in a state all week, she told Craddock. He kept saying Madame Voss was impossible, always demanding changes. Yesterday he told her she'd ruin the production if she didn't follow his direction. She just laughed, said her voice was the production. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Voss's confidence, she thought, was both her strength and her vulnerability. A woman who laughed at a man's authority might provoke more than shouts. She recalled Mrs. Price, a saint, Mary Mead widow, who'd mocked her landlord's threats, only to find her lease mysteriously cancelled. Pride, when wounded, could fester into something darker. As Craddock moved on, Miss Marple slipped into the wings, where the lighting rig cast eerie patterns on the floor. She paused by a rack of costumes, their silks and velvets a stark contrast to the grim mood. A memory surfaced, of a village fete where a jealous baker had laced a rival's pie with a bitter herb, not to kill, but to humiliate. The poisoner's intent, she mused, was not always death, but the result was no less final. Had Randall meant only to sicken Voss, to force her withdrawal and restore his control? Or was his rage deeper, a blaze that consumed all restraint? She overheard a snippet of conversation as two stagehands passed by. "Randall's in trouble now," one muttered. "They say his last show in London lost thousands. If this one fails, he's done for." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Financial ruin, she knew, could drive a man to desperate acts. She thought of Mr. Thompson, a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd burned his own stock to claim insurance, his desperation hidden behind a blustery facade. Randall's temper, she suspected, might be a mask for such straits. She made a mental note to ask Cherry about any rumours of Randall's debts. Cherry, with her knack for village tattle, would surely know if such whispers had reached St. Mary Mead. Returning to the auditorium, Miss Marple settled into a seat, her knitting resumed as a cover for her thoughts. Randall's temper was a beacon, drawing attention, but she wondered if it was too obvious. like a spotlight misaimed. A clever man, she thought, might use his own volatility as a shield, letting others assume his anger was harmless bluster. She recalled the smudge on the program, perhaps nothing, but perhaps a clue, like the stray thread that had unravelled a theft in Saint. Mary Mead when she'd noticed it on a curate's sleeve. Craddock approached, his face weary. "Randall's sticking to his story," he said. "Says he was in the lighting booth when Voss took the glass." The technician confirms it, but he could have slipped out earlier. No one's watching the director every minute. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. A director is like a conductor, Inspector. Always seen, yet not always noticed. I wonder if Mr. Randall's temper is as uncontrolled as it seems. In my village, I've seen men shout to hide their plans. You might look into his movements before the rehearsal. Perhaps ask the doorman if he arrived early. Craddock jotted a note, his respect for her growing. You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I'll check. Meanwhile, I'm off to question Miss Duval. She's next on my list. As he departed, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind racing. Randall's temper was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole. The prop table, the glass, the cyanide, all pointed to a careful hand, not a reckless one. She thought of the theatre as a microcosm of Saint, Mary Mead, where every villager played a role, their secrets hidden behind familiar masks. Randall's role was the tyrant, but tyrants, she knew, could be cunning. She would watch him closely, for in his fire she sensed a spark that might yet illuminate the truth, or burn it away. Chapter 4. The Co-Star's Ambition. The Victoria Hall, its stage now a silent witness to tragedy, seemed to hold its breath as the afternoon light slanted through its dusty windows. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to her seat in the auditorium after her discreet observations, sat with her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with a rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. The death of Madame Helena Voss lingered in the air like a discordant note, and Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Miss Clara Duval, the co-star whose poised demeanour and luminous beauty masked a hunger that Miss Marple recognized all too well. Ambition, she thought, was a flame that could warm a career or consume it, and Clara's flame burned brightly indeed. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case growing murkier by the hour, had moved his inquiries to the small dressing-room assigned to Clara, just off the stage. Miss Marple, with her knack for being unobtrusive, had positioned herself near the corridor leading to the dressing-rooms, where she could overhear snippets of conversation while appearing to adjust her shawl. The corridor was narrow, lined with faded posters of past productions, and the faint scent of grease paint mingled with the sharper tang of tension. Clara's voice, smooth and melodic, drifted out, answering Craddock's questions with a composure that Miss Marple found both admirable and suspect. "I was in here, Inspector," Clara was saying, her tone as polished as her appearance, "preparing for my entrance in Act 2. I had no reason to be near the prop table. I was focused on my lines." She paused, and Miss Marple imagined the tilt of her head, the practised flutter of her lashes. Helena was a marvel, truly. I was content in her. Shadow Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Contentment, she knew, was rarely the companion of ambition. She recalled Miss Emily Barton, a saint, Mary Mead spinster, who had once sabotaged a rival's embroidery at a village fair, her serene smile hiding a heart ablaze with envy. Clara's role as Anina, Violetta's confidant, was minor, a supporting note to Voss's soaring melody. But as understudy, she stood poised to step into the spotlight. The role of Violetta was a prize that could elevate a career from obscurity to fame, and Miss Marple wondered just how far Clara's ambition might stretch. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and made her way towards the dressing room, pausing as if to admire a poster of a long-ago Carmen. The door was ajar, and through the gap she glimpsed Clara seated at a vanity, her reflection framed by a halo of light bulbs. Her blonde hair gleamed, and her green eyes met Craddock's with a steadiness that seemed almost rehearsed. A bottle of perfume sat on the vanity, its crystal facets catching the light, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, a memory stirring of a village chemist's warning about scents that could mask darker substances. Craddock's voice broke her reverie. "Miss Duval, the stagehand says you were near the prop table before the rehearsal, adjusting a shawl. Care to explain?" Clara's laugh was light, like a trill in a minor key. "Oh, that! I was checking my costume for Act 1. A shawl that kept slipping. I wanted it perfect. Surely you don't think I'd tamper with Elena's glass?" Miss Marple's needles, tucked back into her bag, would have clicked if she'd been knitting. The shawl, she thought, was a convenient excuse, much like the one Mrs. Carter, the St. Mary Mead seamstress, had used when caught near a rival's ruined gown, claiming she'd only been adjusting a hem. Excuses, Miss Marple knew, were often the first threads to unravel in a tapestry of deceit. She slipped closer, her presence unnoticed by the constable guarding the corridor, who was distracted by a call from Craddock's sergeant. Leaning slightly, she caught Clara's reflection in the mirror, noting the faint tightening of her jaw as Craddock pressed further. "The glass was wiped clean of prints," he said. "Someone was careful." "And you were close enough to touch it," Clara's smile held, but her fingers brushed the perfume bottle, a gesture so fleeting Miss Marple might have missed it had she not been watching. "Inspector, I'm an actress, not a chemist. I wouldn't know cyanide from sugar syrup. Besides, why would I harm Elena?" Her success was the production's success. Miss Marple's mind turned over the words. Success, she thought, was a relative term. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen ambition drive a young clerk, Mr. Ellis, to forge a ledger to outshine his rival, only to be undone by his own meticulousness. Clara's ambition, she suspected, was no less calculated. The role of Violetta would not only bring fame, but also the attention of critics, patrons, perhaps even a contract in London or Milan. Such a prize could tempt even the most disciplined heart. She recalled Cherry's gossip over breakfast, delivered with the relish of a village bard. "That Miss Duval," Cherry had said, stirring her tea. "She's all smiles, but they say she was furious when Madame Voss got the lead. Kept practicing Violetta's arias in her room, as if she knew she'd get her chance. And the way she looks at Mr. Randall, like she's waiting for him to notice her talent." Miss Marple had nodded, filing away the detail. Now, as she lingered in the corridor, she considered Clara's demeanour during the rehearsal. She had been in the wings, her posture attentive, but her eyes sharp, watching Voss with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. Miss Marple thought of a village girl, Lily Price, who had coveted a rival's place in the choir, and slipped a bitter herb into her tea to spoil her voice. The act had been petty, not fatal, but the intent was the same. to clear a path to glory. Craddock emerged from the dressing room, his notebook tucked under his arm. He spotted Miss Marple and approached, his expression weary. "She's smooth, I'll give her that," he said, keeping his voice low. "Claims she was nowhere near the glass, but the stagehand's certain she lingered by the prop table. Her alibi's thin, says she was alone, practicing lines. No one saw her, which cuts both ways." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the dressing-room door. "Miss Duval is a performer, Inspector, and performers know how to shape a scene. I wonder if her practice was as solitary as she claims. You might ask the wardrobe mistress if she saw her. Costumes, after all, require fittings." Craddock jotted a note, his respect for her insight evident. "You're thinking she's hiding something." "Only that ambition is a powerful lens," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "It distorts what one sees as fair. In my village, I've seen young women smile sweetly while plotting to outshine their rivals. Miss Duval's smile, I think, is worth watching." As Craddock moved off to summon the wardrobe mistress, Miss Marple drifted toward the prop table, now under the watchful eye of a constable. She paused as if lost in thought, and let her gaze sweep the cluttered surface. Goblets, a fan, a crumpled script, all untouched since the tragedy. The constable, recognizing her as the harmless old lady Craddock tolerated, paid her little mind. She bent slightly, as if to retrieve a dropped stitch, and noted a faint gleam under the table, a tiny glass bead, perhaps from a costume, half hidden in the shadows. She left it undisturbed, but her mind catalogued it. A small detail that might yet sing in the chorus of clues. Returning to the auditorium, she settled into a seat. Her knitting resumed as a shield for her thoughts. Clara's ambition was a melody she recognized, one that played in every village and grand stage alike. She thought of the perfume bottle, its almond-like scent a whisper of suspicion. Had Clara, with her actress's guile, disguised cyanide in something as innocent as a fragrance? Miss Marple recalled a scent. Mary Mead chemist, Mr. Hodges, who had once shown her how certain compounds could be masked in small vials, their danger hidden behind a pleasant facade. She would mention the bottle to Craddock, but not yet. Not until she had seen more of Clara's performance. A commotion at the theatre's entrance drew her attention. A reporter from the local paper, his notebook flapping, was speaking to Clara, who had emerged from her dressing room with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. "A terrible loss," Clara said, her voice trembling with just the right note of sorrow. "Elena was a star, and I only hoped to learn from her." Miss Marple's needles paused. The performance was flawless, but performances, she knew, were crafted to conceal as much as they revealed. She thought of the bead under the table, the perfume bottle, the shawl that needed no adjusting. Clara's ambition was a thread in the tapestry of murder, and Miss Marple would tug at it gently, as she did her wool, until the truth unravelled. The stage was set, and Clara, whether she knew it or not, was playing a role that might yet lead to her curtain call. Chapter 5. The Assistant's Anxiety. The Victoria Hall, its grandeur now muted by the shadow of murder, seemed to hum with a quiet unease as the afternoon wore on. The stage, still cordoned off, stood empty, its boards marked by the memory of Madame Elena Voss's final fall. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner of the auditorium, her knitting bag a constant companion, watched the comings and goings with eyes that missed nothing. Her needles moved steadily, a soft counterpoint to the restless energy of Inspector Craddock's investigation. Her thoughts, however, were fixed on Mr. Timothy Wren, the director's assistant, whose nervous demeanour had caught her attention like a discordant note in a familiar tune. Timothy Wren was a slight man, his wiry frame dwarfed by the theatre's looming architecture. His spectacles, perpetually slipping down his nose, gave him the look of a startled owl. And his hands, when not clutching his clipboard, fidgeted with a nervous energy that Miss Marple found telling. She had observed him during the rehearsal, scurrying between the prop table and the wings, his movements jerky, his eyes darting as if expecting rebuke. Now, as Craddock summoned him to the green room for questioning, Miss Marple positioned herself near the corridor, her presence as unremarkable as a stage prop, her ears attuned to the voices within. Inspector Craddock's tone was firm but patient. "Mr. Wren, you fetched the glass of water for Madame Voss, correct? It was your hand that placed it on the prop." Table Timothy's voice, thin and trembling, carried through the door. "Yes, Inspector, but it was just water. I filled it from the jug in the green room, like always. I couldn't do anything to it." His words stumbled, and Miss Marple imagined him pushing his spectacles up, a gesture she'd seen him repeat under stress. She thought of young Tommy Pierce from Saint, Mary Mead, a boy who'd once hidden a stolen watch for an older lad, his nervousness betraying him long before the truth emerged. Fear, Miss Marple knew, could be as revealing as guilt, and Timothy's fear was palpable. Was it the fear of a man caught in a crime, or of one trapped by circumstance? She adjusted her shawl, her mind sifting through the possibilities. Craddock pressed on. "You were seen near the prop table multiple times before the rehearsal, Mr. Wren, and you were the last to handle the glass before Madame Voss took it. That puts you in a difficult position. I was doing my job." Timothy's voice rose, cracking slightly. "Mr. Randall, he's particular about props. I check everything, every detail. The glass, the goblets, the scripts. I make sure it's all perfect. I didn't touch the water after I set it down." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Loyalty, she thought, was a heavy burden, especially when tied to a man like Hugo Randall, whose temper could scorch those in his orbit. She recalled Cherry's gossip over tea, how Timothy had been dismissed from a London theatre years ago for a mix-up with props, nothing proven, but enough to stain his reputation. Had that stain followed him to St. Mary Mead, festering into desperation? Or was he, like Tommy Pierce, merely a pawn in someone else's game? She rose, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention, and drifted toward the stage, where the prop table stood under the constable's watchful eye. The jug Timothy had mentioned, a plain ceramic piece, sat among the clutter, its contents now sealed in an evidence bag. Miss Marple paused, as if admiring the stage's backdrop, and let her gaze sweep the table. A memory surfaced of a saint, Mary Mead Fete, where a nervous boy had spilled lemonade while serving, his hands shaking because he'd known it was tampered with. Timothy's hands, she recalled, had trembled when he'd handed Voss the glass during a break in rehearsal, his eyes avoiding hers. She thought of approaching the constable, but decided against it, instead making her way to the green room's entrance, where she could linger without seeming intrusive. Through the open door, she saw Timothy, his face pale, his clipboard clutched like a shield. Craddock was showing him a photograph of the glass, its surface wiped clean of prints. "Someone was careful, Mr. Wren," Craddock said. "If not you, then who?" "I don't know." Timothy's voice was almost a wail. "Anyone could have come near it. Mr. Randall, Miss Duval, even that fan, Miss Lyle. The tables, right there in the wings, out in the open." Miss Marple's needles, had she been knitting, would have paused. The prop table's openness was its danger, she thought, a stage where anyone could play the villain. But Timothy's role as the assistant gave him unique access, a fact he seemed all too aware of. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead curate, Mr. Ellis, whose nervous deference had hidden a theft, his fear of discovery making him jump at every shadow. Timothy's anxiety, she suspected, might stem from a similar dread, or from knowing more than he dared say. Craddock's voice softened, a tactic Miss Marple recognized as his way of coaxing truth from reluctance. "You're loyal to Mr. Randall, aren't you? Been with him for years, despite that business in London." Timothy flinched, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted them. "That was a misunderstanding," he muttered. "I was young, careless. Mr. Randall gave me a chance when no one else would. I owe him everything." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Loyalty, she thought, could bind a man as tightly as fear, and Timothy's devotion to Randall was a chain she could almost see. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gardiner, Mr. Sims, who'd covered for his employer's misdeeds out of gratitude, only to find himself entangled in a scandal. Had Timothy, in his eagerness to please, been drawn into something darker? Or was his anxiety merely the strain of a man out of his depth? She slipped away from the green room, her steps light, and made her way to the wings, where a costume rack offered a convenient excuse to linger. A stagehand, Tom, was nearby, polishing a brass candelabra for Act 2. Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle. "Such a sad day, Tom. You must see so much, working backstage. Did you notice Mr. Wren this morning? Perhaps checking the props?" Tom nodded, his hands busy with a rag. "Aye, miss. Tim's always fussing over that table. Water, goblets, scripts. He's like a hen with one chick, the way Mr. Randall rides him. Was there before the rehearsal, sure enough, filling that jug and setting out the glass." "Did he seem himself?" she asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Tom shrugged. "Nervous, as usual. Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected Mr. Randall to bark at him. Mind, he's always like that, jumpy as a cat." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her mind turning over the image of Timothy at the prop table, his hands trembling, his eyes wary. She thought of the jug, the glass, the moment when Voss had reached for her water, her trust absolute. Poison, Miss Marple knew, required not just opportunity, but intent, and Timothy's role gave him the former in abundance. But intent, that was less clear. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead boy, young Billy, who'd carried messages for a smuggler, too frightened to question his orders. Was Timothy carrying out someone else's will? Or was his anxiety the mark of his own guilt? Craddock emerged from the green room, his notebook bulging with notes. He spotted Miss Marple and approached, his expression a mix of exasperation and curiosity. "Wren's a bundle of nerves," he said, keeping his voice low. "Admits to handling the glass, but swears it was clean. His alibi's the same as the others, too many people around, no one watching closely. I'm starting to think this prop table's a black hole." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A busy stage is like my village inspector. Everyone sees, but no one looks. Mr. Wren's anxiety is interesting, don't you think? A man so devoted to his employer might do much to please him, or to protect him." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think he's covering for Randall?" "Or for himself," she said, her tone mild. "In Saint. Mary Mead, I knew a boy who broke a window to prove his loyalty to a friend, only to regret it when the truth came out. Mr. Wren's fear may be his own, or it may belong to another. You might ask the doorman if he saw him arrive this morning. Perhaps he was early, with time to prepare." Craddock nodded, jotting another note. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple." "I'll check. Meanwhile, I'm off to speak with Miss Lyle. That woman's devotion gives me the creeps." As he moved away, Miss Marple settled back into her seat, her knitting resumed as a shield for her thoughts. Timothy's anxiety was a thread in the tapestry of murder, fragile but persistent. She thought of the jug, the glass, the open prop table where anyone could have acted. But Timothy's role, his constant presence, made him a figure worth watching. She recalled the smudge on Randall's program, the bead under Clara's table, and now Timothy's trembling hands, small details like the stitches in her knitting that might yet form a pattern. The theatre, she thought, was a stage for human nature. And Timothy Wren, with his nervous loyalty, was playing a part that might yet reveal the truth, or conceal it forever. Chapter 6. The Fan's Devotion. The Victoria Hall, its air heavy with the lingering echo of tragedy, seemed to settle into a restless hush as the day edged toward evening. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the theatre's high windows, casting a soft glow on the crimson seats. But the warmth did little to dispel the chill of Madame Elena Voss's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner of the auditorium, her knitting bag nestled beside her, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. Her needles, though still for the moment, were poised as if ready to stitch together the fragments of the mystery. Her thoughts now turned to Miss Beatrice Lyle, the fan whose devotion to the fallen soprano bordered on the uncanny, a fervour that Miss Marple recognized as both poignant and perilous. Beatrice Lyle was a woman of unremarkable appearance, her plain brown dress and severe bun doing little to draw the eye. Yet her presence, backstage, clutching a bouquet of roses, had been as persistent as a shadow during rehearsals. Miss Marple had noticed her during the morning's performance, standing in the wings with an almost reverent gaze fixed on Voss, her hands twisting the stems of her flowers as if in prayer. Now, as Inspector Craddock summoned Beatrice to the green room for questioning, Miss Marple positioned herself near the foyer's edge, where a faded velvet curtain offered a discreet vantage point. Her small figure, wrapped in a shawl, blended into the surroundings, but her ears were sharp, catching the tremor in Beatrice's voice as she faced the inspector's scrutiny. Craddock's tone was measured, tinged with a hint of discomfort, as he addressed the tearful woman. "Miss Lyle, you were backstage before the rehearsal, delivering flowers to Madame Voss. You were seen near the prop table. Can you explain what you were doing there?" Beatrice's voice, quavering but earnest, drifted through the door. "I only wanted to honor her, Inspector. Elena, Madame Voss, was a gift, a voice like no other. I brought roses, her favorite, and left them on the table. I didn't touch anything else, I swear." A sob broke her words, and Miss Marple imagined her clutching a sodden handkerchief, her eyes red from grief. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Devotion, she knew, could be a pure flame, but it could also burn with an intensity that consumed reason. She recalled Mrs. Finch, a St. Mary Mead widow who had kept a shrine to her late husband, her obsession with his memory driving her to shun the living. Beatrice's adoration of Voss, Cherry had whispered, was no less fervent. Her cottage a museum of programmes, photographs, and even a glove purloined from a London theatre. Such worship, Miss Marple mused, could twist into betrayal if the idol proved flawed or unattainable. She rose, her movement slow to avoid notice, and drifted toward the stage door, where the cool evening air carried the scent of autumn leaves. The prop table, still under guard, stood just beyond, its clutter a silent witness to the crime. Miss Marple paused as if adjusting her shawl, and let her gaze linger on the wilted roses Beatrice had left, their petals scattered like confetti. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead girl, Lily Price, who had once idolized a local singer, only to turn bitter when her letters went unanswered. Had Beatrice's devotion soured into something darker, a need to possess or to destroy what she could not have? Inside the green room, Craddock's voice grew sharper. "Miss Lyle, your admiration for Madame Voss is well known. Some might say it went beyond fandom. You were backstage often, closer than most. Did you ever feel slighted by her? Ignored, perhaps?" Beatrice's reply was a gasp, as if the suggestion wounded her. "Never. Elena was kind. She smiled at me once, in London, after Tosca. I only wanted to be near her, to see her shine. I'd never harm her." Her voice broke again, and Miss Marple noted the raw edge of her emotion, like a string stretched too taut. She thought of the roses, their thorns hidden beneath soft petals. Devotion, she knew, could mask darker impulses, just as thorns could prick the unwary. She recalled a conversation with Cherry that morning, as they'd sipped tea in her cottage. "That Miss Lyle," Cherry had said, her eyes wide. "She's always at the theatre, carrying on about Madame Voss like she's a saint. Got a whole room full of her things, creepy if you ask me. They say she cried when Voss didn't sign her programme last week." Miss Marple had nodded, filing away the detail. Now, as she lingered near the stage, she considered Beatrice's tears. Were they grief for a lost idol, or guilt for a fatal act? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead spinster, Miss Carter, who had once sent anonymous letters to a rival, her love for a local poet twisted into spite when he ignored her. Beatrice's roses, she thought, might hold more than sentiment. A gesture meant to distract, perhaps, from a more sinister purpose. She slipped back into the auditorium, settling into a seat near the wings, where she could observe without being seen. Craddock emerged from the green room, his notebook tucked under his arm, and approached her, his expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Miss Lyle's a puzzle," he said, keeping his voice low. "Says she only left the flowers and didn't touch the glass. But she was there, close enough to do it. Her devotion's intense, almost unnerving." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Devotion can be a powerful force, Inspector, but it's like my roses, beautiful until it pricks. Miss Lyle's love for Madame Voss may have been her joy, but love, when unreturned, can turn to pain. Did she mention where she got the roses?" Craddock flipped through his notes. "From a florist in the village, she says. Delivered them herself this morning." The stagehand confirmed she was hovering near the prop table, but no one saw her touch the glass. "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "In Saint Mary Mead, I knew a woman who sent flowers to a man she admired, only to lace them with a powder that made him sneeze during a speech. A small act, but deliberate. You might ask the florist if Miss Lyle requested anything unusual, perhaps a vial to carry with her flowers." Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting a note. "You think she'd hide poison in roses?" "That's a stretch, even for you, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she said, her smile faint, "but small gestures can hide great intentions. A fan's devotion is like a village's loyalty, fierce but fragile when tested." As Craddock moved off to question the stage manager, Miss Marple drifted toward the prop table, pausing as if to admire the lilies that stood beside Beatrice's roses. The constable, accustomed to her harmless presence, paid her little mind. She bent slightly, as if to adjust her shoe, and noted a single rose petal caught in a crack of the floorboards, its edge stained with a faint dark smudge. It might be nothing, she thought, or it might be a clue, like the stray thread that had unravelled a theft in St. Mary Mead. She left it for the police, but her mind catalogued it, a detail to be woven into the pattern. Returning to her seat, she resumed her knitting, the soft click of needles a cover for her racing thoughts. Beatrice's devotion was a melody she recognized, one that played in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead as much as in the grand theatres of London. She thought of the roses, the smudge, the tears that seemed too copious to be mere grief. Had Beatrice, in her worship, sought to bind Voss to her forever, even in death? Or was her devotion a mask, like the costumes that hung in the wings, concealing a motive as dark as the cyanide that had silenced a star? A commotion at the theatre's entrance drew her attention. Beatrice emerged, her face streaked with tears, clutching a programme as if it were a relic. A reporter approached, his pencil poised, but she waved him away, her voice choked. "Leave me be," she said. "She was everything to me." Miss Marple's needles paused. The words were heartfelt, but their intensity sent a shiver through her. She thought of the smudge on the petal, the roses on the table, the open wings where anyone could have acted. Beatrice's devotion was a thread in the tapestry of murder, delicate but persistent. Miss Marple would watch her closely, for in her tears she sensed a truth that might yet break the silence of the stage. Chapter 7. The Clues Unravelled. The Victoria Hall, as evening draped its shadows over St. Mary Mead, seemed to settle into a sombre hush, its stage a silent monument to the tragedy of Madame Elena Voss's death. The auditorium, now dimmed, held only a handful of lingering figures, constables guarding the crime scene, a stagehand tidying props, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting bag at her side. Her needles moved with a quiet rhythm, a deceptive calm that masked the swift workings of her mind. The day's interrogations had painted a vivid picture of motives and opportunities, but it was the small overlooked details that now drew her focus, like threads waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. Inspector Craddock, his face lined with the fatigue of a long day, had retreated to the theatre's office to review the autopsy report, which had arrived just before dusk. Miss Marple, invited to join him under the pretext of offering a woman's perspective, sat across from him at a cluttered desk, her shawl neatly folded over her lap. The report, delivered by Dr. Haydock, confirmed what the doctor had suspected at the scene. Cyanide, administered through the water glass, had killed Voss within minutes. The poison's swiftness was chilling, its almond-like scent noted by the doctor as a faint trace on her lips. Craddock, flipping through the pages, shook his head. "No fingerprints on the glass," he said, his voice heavy. "Wiped clean, deliberately." Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, flickered with interest. "A careful hand, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "Cyanide is not a casual choice. It requires planning, access, and a certain boldness. Yet it was placed in a glass meant only for Madame Voss, which suggests an intimate knowledge of her habits." Craddock nodded, his pencil tapping the report. "She always took water mid-aria," the stagehand said. "Part of her routine. Everyone backstage knew it." He paused, rubbing his temple. "That prop table's the devil of it, open to all, but no one saw a thing. Randall, Duval, Wren, Lyle, they were all near it at some point." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A busy stage is like a village square, Inspector, full of movement, but the right moment can hide a deed. I wonder if you've heard about the vial found in the wings?" Craddock's head snapped up. "Vial? What vial?" She inclined her head, her expression serene. "Tom, the stagehand, mentioned it to me while I was near the prop table. A small glass vial, empty, tucked behind a curtain in the wings. He thought it odd, said it smelled of almonds. Your men took it, I believe." Craddock cursed softly, flipping through his notes. "They did. Blast it. Forgot to mention, found it just after we secured the scene. No prints, of course. Smelled like cyanide, though the lab's confirming it. Could be our murder weapon." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the wool in her bag. "A vial suggests preparation, Inspector. Someone brought it to the theatre, knowing its purpose. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a chemist's assistant who mislabeled a bottle to spite his employer. A small act, but dangerous. You might ask who had access to such things, perhaps a chemist, or someone with a connection to one." Craddock jotted a note, his respect for her insight evident. "I'll have my men check local chemists, but it's a needle in a haystack. Cyanide's not exactly common, but it's not impossible to get if you know where to look." Miss Marple's mind turned over the details. The glass, the vial, the prop table's clutter of goblets, scripts, and Beatrice Lyle's roses. She recalled the smudge on Randall's program, the bead under Clara's table, the petal stained near Beatrice's flowers. Each was a fragment, like the scattered notes of a melody waiting to be played. She thought of the theatre's layout, which she'd asked to see earlier that day. A simple sketch provided by the stage manager. The prop table stood in the wings, just steps from the co-star's dressing room, the director's chair, and the stage door where Beatrice had entered. Timothy Wren, with his constant scurrying, had been its guardian, yet even he could not watch it every moment. She rose, her movements slow, and requested to see the stage again, citing a need to stretch her legs. Craddock, accustomed to her wanderings, nodded, and she made her way to the wings, where the constable stood guard. The prop table, now stripped of its fatal glass, held a jumble of items, goblets for Act 1, a fan for Clara's scene, a script marked with Randall's scrawl. Miss Marple paused, as if admiring the lilies, and let her gaze drift to the floor, where the stained petals still lay, unnoticed by the police. She bent, as if to retrieve a dropped stitch, and noted its dark edge. Perhaps ink, perhaps something more sinister. She left it for Craddock's men, but its image lingered in her mind, a clue as delicate as the thread in her knitting. Returning to the office, she found Craddock poring over witness statements. "Anything catch your eye, Miss Marple?" he asked, half hoping for one of her cryptic insights. "Only that the prop table is a stage of its own," she said, settling into her chair. "It's like my garden, Inspector. Everything grows together, but only one plant holds the poison. I noticed Miss Duval's dressing room is closest to the table. A step or two, and she could have reached it unseen." Craddock frowned, checking his sketch of the theatre. "You're right. Her room's just off the wings. Randall's chair is close too, and Wren was all over the place. Lyle came through the stage door, bit farther, but not impossible." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "And the vial, Inspector?" "Its placement in the wings suggests haste, or perhaps misdirection. Someone meant it to be found, or hoped it wouldn't be. In St. Mary Mead, I once found a broken teacup hidden in a hedge, meant to distract from a theft. Small things, you see, can point to great truths." Craddock leaned back, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You see too much, Miss Marple. I've got 4 suspects, all with access, all with motives. Randall's temper, Duval's ambition, Wren's nerves, Lyle's obsession, but no proof. Yet." She smiled faintly, her hands folding over her bag. "Proof is like a melody, Inspector. It emerges when the notes align. You might look into the vial's origin. A chemist, perhaps, or a supplier for theatrical props. And the dressing rooms, Miss Duval's perfume, for instance. Scents can be deceptive, can they not?" Craddock's eyes narrowed, catching her drift. "You think the poison was in her perfume?" "That's a leap. Perhaps," she said, her tone gentle. "But in my village, I knew a woman who hid laudanum in a scent bottle, thinking it innocent. Small bottles, Inspector, can hold great secrets." As Craddock made another note, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the theatre's players, each a character in a drama of their own making. Randall's fire, Clara's ambition, Timothy's fear, Beatrice's devotion, all were threads, but the vial was the needle that might sew them together. She thought of the stained petal, the bead, the smudge, clues that whispered of intent and opportunity. The stage, she mused, was a mirror of Saint Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, waiting for a quiet eye to see them. She would watch and listen and knit until the pattern of murder emerged, clear as a final aria. Chapter 8. The village parallel, the Victoria Hall, as twilight deepened over St. Mary Mead, took on a ghostly stillness, its auditorium now empty save for the faint creak of settling timbers. The stage, cordoned off and silent, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next act in the tragedy of Madame Elena Voss's death. Miss Jane Marple, having left the theatre to attend the vicarage tea, sat in the cosy parlour of the Reverend Mr. Clement, her knitting bag at her feet. The room was warm with the glow of a fire, and the chatter of village ladies filled the air with a comforting hum, but Miss Marple's mind was far from the scones and gossip. Her thoughts wove through the clues of the day, the vial, the smudged petal, the bead, the prop table's deadly accessibility, each a stitch in the tapestry of murder she was determined to unravel. The tea, an annual event to support the church's organ fund, was a hub of Saint Mary Mead's social pulse, and Miss Marple, with her knack for blending into such gatherings, listened, as the conversation turned inevitably to the theatre's tragedy. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, leaned forward, her eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, passing a plate of cucumber sandwiches. "Madame Voss, poisoned in our own theatre. They say it was cyanide, quick as lightning. Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple accepted a sandwich, her expression serene. "A terrible loss, indeed," she said, her voice soft. "But human nature, Mrs. Price, is much the same in a theatre as in our village. Passions run high, and small slights can grow into great wrongs." The other ladies nodded, their curiosity piqued. Miss Hartnell, a robust woman with a penchant for bluntness, chimed in. "I heard the director, that Mr. Randall, was furious with her, shouting fit to bring the roof down. And that co-star, Miss Duval, she's a sly one, always smiling but with eyes like a cat." Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. The village, she thought, was a mirror of the theatre. Its gossip a lens through which truth could sometimes be glimpsed. She recalled a choir rivalry in St. Mary Mead years ago, where Miss Emily Barton, a meek soprano, had slipped a bitter herb into a rival's tea to spoil her voice for a solo. The act had been petty, born of envy, but its echoes resonated now. "In my experience," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "envy can be a quiet poison, working its way into the heart. I once knew a young woman who tampered with a co-rival's sheet music, just to shine a little brighter. Small acts, you see, can lead to great harm." The ladies gasped, delighted by the parallel, and Mrs. Price pressed her. "Do you think it was envy, then, Miss Marple? That Miss Duval, perhaps, wanting the lead role?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "I shouldn't speculate," she said, though her mind was doing just that. "But ambition, like envy, can cloud judgment. And devotion, too. Miss Lyle, the fan, loved Madame Voss dearly. Love can be as dangerous as hate, don't you think?" Miss Hartnell snorted. "That Miss Lyle gives me the shivers." Always at the theatre, clutching her programmes like relics. "I saw her in the village yesterday, buying roses at Mr. Hodges' shop. Looked half mad with worry, muttering about Madame Voss deserving only the best Miss Marple's needles. Had she been knitting, would have paused. The roses, she thought, with their stained petal, were a thread worth tugging. She recalled the vial found in the wings, its almond-like scent a whisper of cyanide. Had Beatrice's devotion led her to a desperate act, or was her fervour a distraction, like the bright blooms hiding thorns? She made a mental note to visit Mr. Hodges' florist shop, where village gossip might reveal more than Beatrice had admitted. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently, drawing out details. Mrs. Weatherby, a nervous woman with a knack for overhearing, mentioned Timothy Wren. "That poor boy," she said, stirring her tea. "Always jumping at shadows, running after Mr. Randall like a puppy. I heard he was sacked from a London theatre, something about props going missing. Makes you wonder what he's capable of." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind alert. Timothy's anxiety, she thought, was like a cracked bell, ringing with every question. She recalled a St. Mary Mead lad, young Billy, who had carried stolen goods for an older boy, his fear making him clumsy. Was Timothy's loyalty to Randall a shield for his own actions, or a chain binding him to another's will? The village parallel, she mused, was striking, each suspect a reflection of St. Mary Mead's own dramas, where envy, fear, and devotion played out in quieter ways. Excusing herself from the tea, Miss Marple slipped out into the evening, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. She made her way to the theatre, where Inspector Craddock was overseeing a final sweep of the stage. The prop table, now nearly bare, stood under a harsh spotlight, its remaining items tagged for evidence. Craddock spotted her and approached, his notebook bulging with notes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice weary, "you've been at the vicarage, I hear." "Any village wisdom to share?" She smiled faintly, her eyes on the table. "Only that people are much the same, Inspector, whether on a stage or in a village. I was thinking of Miss Duval's dressing. Room, did you notice her perfume bottle? A lovely scent, but some say it has an almond-like note." Craddock's brow furrowed. "You mentioned that before. You really think she'd hide cyanide in perfume?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "In Saint Mary Mead, I knew a woman who kept a dangerous tonic in a scent bottle, thinking it harmless. I wonder if Miss Duval's bottle might hold more than fragrance. And Miss Lyle's roses, Mr. Hodge, the florist, might know if she asked for anything unusual." Craddock jotted a note, his respect for her growing. "I'll have the bottle tested. And I'll send a man to Hodge's. You're uncanny, Miss Marple, seeing clues where I see clutter." She inclined her head, her expression serene. "It's only observation, Inspector. Like tending my roses, you notice the pests before they ruin the bloom. The vial in the wings, the bead, the petal, all small things, but they tell a story." As Craddock moved off to confer with his sergeant, Miss Marple lingered near the stage, her gaze drifting to the spot where Voss had fallen. The theatre, she thought, was a village in miniature, its players bound by the same passions that stirred Saint, Mary Mead. She recalled the smudge on Randall's programme, the bead under Clara's table, the stained petal by Beatrice's roses, Timothy's trembling hands. Each was a clue, like the stray threads in a village scandal, waiting to be woven into truth. She thought of the perfume bottle, its almond scent a faint echo of the cyanide's trace. Clara's ambition, she suspected, was the strongest thread, but Beatrice's devotion and Timothy's fear could not be dismissed, nor could Randall's temper. She returned to her seat, her knitting resumed as a cover for her thoughts. The village parallel was clear. Envy, fear, love, and pride were universal, playing out in the theatre as they did in Saint. Mary Mead's lanes. She would visit Mr. Hodge's shop tomorrow to ask about Beatrice's roses, and she would watch Clara closely, her smile too perfect to be trusted. The clues were unravelling, like wool from a skein, and Miss Marple knew that with patience the pattern of murder would emerge as clear and inevitable as the final note of an aria. Chapter 9. The Confrontation, the Victoria Hall, as night settled over St. Mary Mead, stood like a sentinel in the darkness, its windows glinting faintly under the moon's pale glow. The auditorium, now empty save for the lingering presence of tragedy, held a silence that seemed to whisper of secrets yet unveiled. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to the theatre at Inspector Craddock's request, sat in the front row, her knitting bag at her side, her shawl draped over her shoulders against the evening chill. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, surveyed the stage where Madame Elena Voss had fallen, and her mind wove together the clues that had emerged. The smudged programme, the glass bead, the stained petal, the vial's almond scent, and the perfume bottle that lingered in her thoughts like a haunting refrain. Craddock, his face etched with determination, had gathered the 4 suspects, Hugo Randall, Clara Duval, Timothy Wren, and Beatrice Lyle, in the auditorium, their figures illuminated by a single spotlight that cast long shadows across the seats. The inspector, though methodical, had admitted to Miss Marple over a hurried cup of tea that the case was a tangle of motives and opportunities with no clear thread to pull. "I need a breakthrough," he'd said, half in frustration. "You've a way of seeing through the fog, Miss Marple. Will you join us? They might let something slip if you're there." Miss Marple had agreed, her presence unassuming but her purpose keen. She knew the theatre was a stage for truth as much as for performance, and a confrontation, like a well-staged scene, could reveal what questions alone could not. As the suspects took their places, Randall pacing near the orchestra pit, Clara seated with poised grace, Timothy clutching his clipboard, and Beatrice twisting her handkerchief, Miss Marple settled into her role as observer, her knitting needles still but her mind as active as ever. Craddock stood centre stage, his notebook tucked away, his voice carrying the authority of a conductor. "We're here because one of you poisoned Madame Elena Voss," he said, his gaze sweeping the group. "Cyanide in her water glass, placed on the prop table where all of you had access. No fingerprints, no witnesses, but plenty of reasons. Let's go through it, shall we?" Randall's silver mane gleamed under the spotlight as he snorted, his arms crossed. "This is absurd, Inspector. I've told you, I needed Voss alive. She was the heart of this production. My temper's no secret, but murder?" Preposterous Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him, noting the defiance in his stance, like a saint. Mary Mead Squire, who'd once blustered through a scandal to hide his debts. She recalled the smudge on his programme, a detail yet to be explained, and wondered if his bluster was a curtain drawn over desperation. Clara Duval, her green eyes steady, offered a faint smile. "I've said all I can, Inspector. I was in my dressing room, preparing. Elena's death is a tragedy for us all." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple saw her fingers tighten on her shawl, a gesture as telling as a missed note in a village choir. Timothy Wren, his spectacles glinting, stammered, I only fetch the water. I didn't touch it after I set it down. You can't think I'd do such a thing." His hands shook, and Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead Boy, young Billy, whose nerves had betrayed him when questioned about a stolen pie. Beatrice Lyle, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutched her handkerchief like a lifeline. "I loved Elena," she whispered. "I'd never hurt her. My roses were a gift. Nothing more." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Finch, whose devotion to a lost love had turned to obsession, her tears a mask for deeper pain. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a quiet bell. "It's a curious thing, isn't it, how a theatre mirrors a village? In St. Mary Mead, I've seen tempers flare, ambitions clash, fears tremble, and loves turn bitter. Each of you had a reason to resent Madame Voss, however small, but only one of you placed cyanide in her glass." The suspects shifted, their eyes darting, Randall with a scowl, Clara with a flicker of unease, Timothy with a twitch, Beatrice with a sob. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "The prop table was a busy place, like a village market. Mr. Randall, you checked the goblets, did you not, to ensure the scene was perfect?" Randall nodded curtly. "Of course, it's my job. And Miss Duval," she said, turning to Clara, "you adjusted your shawl near the table, perhaps brushing against the glass?" Clara's smile tightened, but she said nothing. "Mr. Wren, you filled the jug and placed the glass, your hands always busy. And Miss Lyle, your roses lay just beside it. A lovely gesture, but so close to the poison." Craddock, catching her rhythm, stepped forward. "We found a vial in the wings, empty, with a trace of cyanide. Someone brought it here, someone who knew Voss's habits. Who was it?" The silence was heavy, broken only by Beatrice's soft weeping. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara, whose composure seemed to falter, her fingers now gripping the shawl like a lifeline. "Miss Duval," Miss Marple said gently, "I couldn't help but notice your perfume bottle in the dressing room. A lovely scent, but some say it has an almond-like note. A small thing, but small things betray great crimes." Clara's eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking her mask. "My perfume! That's ridiculous! It's just a gift, nothing more." Her voice rose, a note too sharp, and Miss Marple saw Randall glance at her, his brow furrowing. Craddock seized the moment, his voice firm. "We'll test that bottle, Miss Duval. If there's cyanide in it, or any trace, you'll have more to explain." Clara's smile vanished, her hands trembling now. "You can't think I wouldn't—" She stopped, her breath catching, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes, like a curtain parting to reveal the stage. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice steady. "In my village, I knew a girl who envied another's place in a choir. She meant only to sicken her rival, not to harm her fatally, but intent is a slippery thing. The role of Violetta, Miss Duval, was a prize worth coveting, was it not?" The auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Randall blustered, "This is nonsense!" Timothy shrank back, his clipboard a shield. Beatrice's sobs grew quieter, her eyes fixed on Clara. And Clara, cornered by the spotlight of truth, let her shawl slip, her face pale. Craddock stepped closer, his tone unrelenting. "Miss Duval, if that bottle holds what we suspect, it's over." "Tell us now, and save us the trouble." Miss Marple watched, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. The theatre, like St. Mary Mead, was a place where human nature played its roles. Pride, envy, fear, devotion. Clara's ambition, she thought, had written the final act, and the curtain was about to fall. Chapter 10. The Confession. The Victoria Hall, shrouded in the stillness of night, seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. Its auditorium a silent witness to the unravelling of a deadly truth. The single spotlight that bathed the stage cast stark shadows, illuminating the four suspects: Hugo Randall, Clara Duval, Timothy Wren, and Beatrice Lyle, as they stood or sat, each a player in a drama that had reached its climax. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the front row, her knitting bag untouched at her side, watched with eyes that missed nothing, her serene expression belying the keenness of her mind. The air was thick with tension, as if the theatre itself awaited the final note of the tragedy that had begun with Madame Elena Voss's death. Inspector Craddock, standing centre stage, had pressed Clara Duval with a question that hung like a sword. The perfume bottle, suspected of holding more than fragrance, was to be tested for traces of cyanide. Clara's composure, so carefully maintained, had crumbled under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle observation about its almond-like scent. Her green eyes, once steady, now flickered with panic, and her hands clutching her shawl trembled visibly. The other suspects, sensing the shift, watched her with varying degrees of shock and suspicion. Randall with a scowl, Timothy with wide-eyed fear, Beatrice with a tearful stare. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but carrying the clarity of truth. Miss Duval, ambition is a powerful force, like a river that carves its own path. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young woman who coveted a rival's place so fiercely that she acted without thought of the consequences. The role of Violetta was such a prize, was it not? A chance to step out of the shadows and into the light. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came at first. The spotlight seemed to pin her in place, her face pale as the velvet curtain behind her. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered finally, her voice breaking like a string snapped mid-aria. The words, barely audible, sent a ripple through the group, and Craddock's eyes sharpened, his notebook forgotten as he leaned forward. "Go on, Miss Duval," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Tell us what happened." Clara's shoulders sagged, her shawl slipping to the floor as she covered her face with her hands. "It was only meant to make her ill," she said, her voice muffled but growing steadier as she spoke. "Just enough to keep her from performing, to give me a chance. Elena was impossible. Her voice, her presence. She filled every room, left no space for anyone else. I'd worked so hard, practiced Violetta's arias for months, knowing I could shine if only I had the chance." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind remained alert. She thought of Lily Price, a saint, Mary Mead girl who had tampered with a rival's tea, intending only to spoil her voice for a day. Ambition, she knew, could blind even the cleverest to the line between mischief and murder. Clara's confession, raw and unpolished, rang with the truth of a heart laid bare. Craddock's voice cut through the silence. "The cyanide, Miss Duval. Where did you get it?" Clara lowered her hands, her eyes glistening but resolute. "A chemist in London," she said. I used a false name, said it was for a theatrical effect, a prop for a play. It wasn't hard. They believed me. I hid it in my perfume bottle, diluted so it wouldn't be fatal. I thought just a sip, enough to make her faint, to miss the performance. I didn't know her heart was weak, that it would—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, as if to banish the image of Voss's collapse. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The perfume bottle, she thought, was a clever choice. Its almond-like scent a perfect mask for the cyanide's trace. She recalled Mr. Hodges, the saint, Mary Mead chemist, warning her of how easily such compounds could be disguised in small vials. Clara's plan, meticulous yet flawed, echoed the miscalculations of village schemers who underestimated their own actions. Randall, his face flushed with outrage, stepped forward. "You little fool," he roared. "You've ruined everything, the production, my career, because of your jealousy." His fists clenched, and a constable moved to restrain him. But Miss Marple noted the flicker of relief in his eyes, as if the truth absolved his own temper. Timothy Wren, his spectacles fogging with nervous sweat, stammered, I didn't know." "I fetched the water, but I didn't see her do anything." His voice was a plea, and Miss Marple saw in him the fear of a man who had brushed too close to guilt, like a saint. Mary Mead boy caught in another's mischief. Beatrice Lyle, her tears now silent, stared at Clara with a mix of horror and betrayal. "You took her from us," she whispered. "Elena was a gift, and you stole her." Her handkerchief fell to the floor, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Finch, whose devotion had turned to despair when her idol proved mortal. Craddock signalled to a constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Clara Duval, you're under arrest for the murder of Elena Voss," he said, his voice steady. "You'll come with us to the station." Clara nodded, her fight gone, and allowed the constable to lead her away. Her steps were slow, as if the weight of her confession had drained her of the grace that had defined her. The spotlight followed her for a moment, then dimmed, leaving the stage in shadow. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded over her bag, her heart heavy with the tragedy of it all. Clara's ambition, she thought, had been a flame too bright, consuming not just Voss, but her own future. She recalled the smudged programme, the bead, the stained petal, all clues that had pointed to the truth, like the small signs in Saint. Mary Mead that had unravelled a theft or a lie. The perfume bottle, now in Craddock's custody, would confirm the cyanide source, but Miss Marple needed no further proof. The confession had been the final act, the curtain falling on a drama of envy and error. Craddock approached her, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You were right about the perfume, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "How did you know?" "Only observation, Inspector," she said, her smile faint. "In my village, I've seen ambition lead to folly before. A small act meant to wound can cut too deep. Miss Duval's heart was set on glory, but glory, you see, is a fickle prize." He nodded, jotting a final note. "We'll test the bottle, but her confession's enough." "The case is closed, thanks to you," Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "Not thanks to me, Inspector, but to the truth, which has a way of shining through, like a light through a cracked door." As Craddock moved off to oversee Clara's transfer, Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted, and made her way to the theatre's exit. The night air was crisp, the village quiet save for the distant hum of gossip already spreading. She thought of the theatre, its stage a mirror of Saint. Mary Mead, where human nature played out its passions and mistakes. Clara's confession had ended the mystery, but the tragedy lingered, a reminder that even the brightest talents could fall to the shadows of envy. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her mind already turning to the quiet of her cottage, where a cup of tea and her knitting awaited, ready to weave new patterns from the threads of human folly. Chapter 11. The Curtain Falls. The Victoria Hall, its grandeur dimmed by the weight of tragedy, stood silent under the starlit sky of St. Mary Mead, its doors locked and its stage empty. The village, usually abuzz with the chatter of daily life, seemed to hold its breath in the wake of Clara Duval's arrest for the murder of Madame Eleanor Voss. Miss Jane Marple, walking slowly along the lane to her cottage, her shawl drawn tight against the September chill, felt the quiet as a kind of reverence, a pause before the world resumed its rhythm. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar companion, but her mind was still on the theatre, where the drama of human nature had played out with fatal consequence. The festival, once the pride of St. Mary Mead, was cancelled, its posters torn down or left to fade in shop windows. The news of Clara's confession had spread like wildfire, carried by the village's efficient gossip network. Miss Marple, pausing at her garden gate, glanced at the roses that lined her path, their petals curling in the cool night air. They reminded her of Beatrice Lyle's roses, left on the prop table as a gesture of devotion, now tainted by the shadow of murder. She thought of Clara, whose ambition had burned too brightly, and of Voss, whose voice would never again fill the hall. Human folly, she mused, was as universal as the seasons, blooming and fading in turn. Inside her cottage, Cherry Baker, her maid, had left a fire crackling in the hearth, and the kettle was simmering on the stove. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, and let her thoughts drift over the case's resolution. Hugo Randall, the director, had been seen in the village pub, his bluster subdued as he spoke of staging a tribute to Voss in London, a way to salvage his reputation. Miss Marple, recalling his temper, suspected he would throw himself into the project with the same ferocity that had once clashed with Voss's demands. She thought of Mr. Grayson, a St. Mary Mead butcher who, after a scandal, had rebuilt his trade with dogged determination. Randall, she felt, would survive, his pride bruised but intact. Timothy Wren, the nervous assistant, had found new employment with a touring company, his loyalty to Randall no longer binding him to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had heard from Cherry that he'd left the village quietly, his spectacles still slipping, his hands still trembling. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, who had fled St. Mary Mead after a petty theft, seeking a fresh start. Timothy, she thought, was not guilty of murder, but his fear had made him a shadow in the drama, a reminder that loyalty could blind as much as it bound. Beatrice Lyle, the fan, had retreated to her cottage, her shrine to Voss dismantled, its relics packed away in sorrow. Miss Marple, passing the florist's shop that morning, had learned from Mr. Hodge that Beatrice had bought no more roses, her devotion extinguished by grief. She thought of Mrs. Finch, the saint, Mary Mead widow, whose obsession had faded when her idol proved mortal. Beatrice, Miss Marple hoped, would find peace in time, her heart turning to quieter joys, like the village gardens that bloomed anew each spring. Inspector Craddock had called on Miss Marple earlier that day, his manner a mix of gratitude and awe. The perfume bottle tested positive for cyanide traces, he'd said, standing in her parlour. Diluted, as she claimed, but enough to kill, given Voss's weak heart. Your hunch was spot on, Miss Marple. She had smiled, offering him tea. Not a hunch, Inspector, but observation. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small things, a glance, a gesture, reveal great truths. Miss Duval's ambition was her undoing, as it was for many before her. Craddock had nodded, sipping his tea. The case is closed, but the Shuahar village won't stop talking about it. You've a gift, Miss Marple, seeing what we miss. She had waved off the compliment, her eyes on her roses through the window. It's only human nature, Inspector. Like my garden, it follows patterns, if you know where to look. Now, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The soft click of needles a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. The theatre, she reflected, was a stage for the same passions that stirred her village: envy, pride, fear, devotion. Clara's confession had drawn the curtain on the mystery, but the tragedy lingered, a reminder of how fragile glory could be. She thought of the smudged programme, the glass bead, the stained petal, all clues that had whispered of truth, like the small signs in St. Mary Mead that had unravelled scandals and secrets. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a photograph on her mantel, a gift from her nephew Raymond, showing the Victoria Hall in its festival glory. She hoped Voss's voice would echo in memory, a melody preserved despite the discord of her end. The case was closed, But Miss Marple knew the village would soon stir with new dramas, new threads to weave. For now, she was content to sit by her fire, her needles moving, her mind at rest, ready for whatever mystery the next season might bring. Chapter 12. The Quiet Reflection. The autumn sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and gold, its light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the roses in her garden, though past their summer peak, stood resilient against the morning dew. Inside, Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the window, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her, her knitting bag open but untouched. The events at the Victoria Hall, now a week past, had settled into the village's collective memory, a tale to be recounted over teacups and garden fences. Yet for Miss Marple, the resolution of Madame Helena Voss's murder lingered like the final note of a melancholy aria, clear but tinged with sorrow. Cherry Baker, bustling into the parlour with a tray of scones, broke the silence with her usual cheer. "Morning, miss. The village is still all a-flutter about that opera business. They're saying Miss Duval's to be tried in London. Can you imagine? Poison, right here in St. Mary Mead." She set the tray down, her eyes bright with the thrill of it all. Miss Marple smiled faintly, stirring her tea. "Yes, Cherry, it's a sad affair. Ambition can lead one astray, like a rose that grows too wild and chokes the garden." Cherry nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "You saw it coming, didn't you, miss? The way you pointed out that perfume bottle. Everyone's talking about it. Mrs. Price at the vicarage says you're sharper than Sherlock Holmes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but she waved off the compliment. "It's only observation, Cherry. People are like my roses, beautiful, but you must watch for the thorns." Miss Duval's ambition was plain to see, if one looked closely. Cherry perched on the edge of a chair, her curiosity unabated. "But how did you know, miss? All those clues, the programme, the bead, that petal, how did you put it together?" Miss Marple took a sip of tea, her gaze drifting to the garden. "In St. Mary Mead, Cherry, I've learned that small things tell great stories. A smudge on Mr. Randall's programme suggested he'd handled something more than paper, perhaps a vial, though he was innocent. The bead under Miss Duval's table spoke of her presence at the prop table, despite her claims. And the petal by Miss Lyle's roses, stained with a dark mark, hinted at carelessness, but not guilt. It was the perfume bottle, with its almond-like scent, that tied it to Miss Duval. In my village, I once knew a woman who hid a dangerous tonic in a similar bottle, thinking it harmless. The patterns are always there, if you know where to look." Cherry shook her head, marvelling. "You're a wonder, miss. The theatre folk thought they were so grand, but you saw right through them." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "The theatre, Cherry, is no different from our village. Pride, envy, fear, devotion, they play out everywhere, on stages grand and small. Miss Duval coveted Madame Voss's light, and in trying to dim it, she extinguished her own." She rose, her movements slow, and walked to the window, where the roses nodded in the breeze. The Victoria Hall, visible in the distance, stood quiet, its festival posters now gone, replaced by notices for a harvest fair. She thought of Hugo Randall, planning his tribute in London, his temper now channeled into ambition. Of Timothy Wren, starting anew with a touring company, his nerves perhaps steadied by distance. of Beatrice Lyle, whose cottage was said to be emptier now, her shrine to Voss packed away in grief, and of Clara Duval, whose trial would echo the tragedy in headlines, her ambition a cautionary tale. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a faded poster tucked into her knitting bag, a memento of the festival's opening night. Madame Voss's face smiled from it, her eyes alight with the promise of song. A voice like hers, Miss Marple murmured, should have sung for years. But human nature, Cherry, is a fragile thing, easily swayed by want or wounded pride. Cherry, clearing the tray, paused. Will you go to the theatre again, miss? After all this? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I think so. Music, like my roses, has a way of healing. And Saint Mary Mead, you know, is never without its dramas. I'll be ready for the next one, with my knitting and a cup of tea. She settled back into her armchair, her needles clicking softly as she began a new row. The village was quiet for now, its secrets laid bare, but Miss Marple knew that human nature, like her garden, would soon stir again. She sipped her tea, her mind at peace, ready to unravel whatever mystery the next season might bring, as certain as the roses that would bloom again come spring.